Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us at our 5th season of Conversations with Clinicians. It is really great to see so many people I respect highly, former colleagues. I'm Salima Snow. I'm a professor of law here at UDC, and I direct our Youth Justice Clinic. I'm excited to start the third episode, I should say, of Conversations with Clinicians. For those of you who were unable to join us for the first 2 episodes for the season, we began by exploring collaborations between social work programs and law clinics. And I will put the link in the chat shortly so you can find those episodes along with some of our other conversations that we had from previous seasons. Conversations with Clinicians is a series where we feature UDC School of Law clinicians in discussion with leaders in the experiential education field. As an alum of our predecessor law school, DC School of Law, I must say that our clinical program has been really at the forefront of clinical legal education. When I graduated from law school in '97, I had a clinic my first year in law school, my second year in law school, my third year of law school, and we have continued much of that tradition to this day. Our evening students all take between 10 mandatory clinical credit hours for graduation. Our day students take 14 mandatory clinic hours as a graduation requirement. And so we developed this series to really create that space where clinicians from across the country and actually, I guess, the world can engage in topics of interest while exploring some of the pressing issues facing our community. And we all know there are many more than we could have ever imagined today. So we like to start with cameras off until we reach our Q&A portion, where we'll then welcome you to join us on screen. So I'm excited to do all 3 of these introductions. I'm thrilled that my colleague, Professor Mimi Marton, the director of our general practice clinic, who also has a master's in social work herself, will be in conversation with Lindsay Harris. Lindsay actually was a former dean of experiential and clinical programs here at UDC, and she's now professor of law and the clinical director of the Frank C. Newman International Human Rights Clinic at the University of San Francisco School of Law. Mimi will also be in conversation with Nicole Tuchinda, also a former part of the UDC clinic family, who is now an assistant professor of law and health law program academic director at Loyola University, New Orleans College of Law. Professor Harris edited the remarkable book, How to Account for Trauma in Law Teaching, that Dr. Tuchinda contributed to the chapter, Navigating Trauma and Emotions While Teaching Torts. So today we're exploring clinics and their evolving approach to self-care, something that I really strongly feel that we don't spend enough time on. So really excited about Lindsay's book and Nicole's contributions to it. So I will turn it over to Mimi for our conversations with clinicians.
Thank you, Professor Snow, for that lovely introduction. I first want to echo Professor Snow in thanking everyone for taking time on a Friday afternoon for us to continue this tradition started by Professor Harris. So I have been, as Professor Snow said, I have a master's in social work as well as a JD, and I have been looking at the issues of trauma in legal education and lawyering since about 2012. And while there's still a lot of work to do, and we'll talk about that today too, since 2012, there's been a broadening and a deepening of our understanding of trauma in the law in some really important ways. So today we're going to look at some of those shifts, and then we're going to spend some time discussing what trauma looks like in legal education, including, of course, as promised, what self-care looks like, and what self-care means in a political environment that is hostile to the work that most of us in this room do. And then we'll leave about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for any participant questions. So let's get started. So Lindsay and Nicole, can you spend a few minutes talking about how you came to the realization that trauma is a really important piece and belongs in legal education and in lawyering.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Mimi and Salima, for those lovely introductions. It's really an honor to be here with you all. I'm excited to be back engaging with UDC law in particular, which will always have a special place in my heart, and definitely especially conversations with clinicians, and see this series continue. So for me, I think trauma has always been a part of how I have personally engaged with the law, and it took me a while to realize that, and even to connect the fact that my own personal experience had driven me to the law and to engage with other survivors. So for me, not doing so, not engaging with trauma and integrating thinking about trauma and emotions into my teaching would mean that I wasn't really bringing my whole self to the classroom, to the practice of law, and it would be showing up in really an inauthentic way for me. That's obviously not going to be the same for everybody, but I am a survivor myself of gender-based violence, and I'm often doing work around gender-based violence and persecution. It's definitely not all about me, but it's necessary to kind of engage with that. And I taught in very different settings. I started my career with a fellowship at Georgetown, and then I taught at UDC. And given my subject matter expertise, most of my students have been majority female. And we know that at least a third of women who have graduated from a US college or university have come into contact with, have been sexually assaulted or raped at some point. And those numbers can be even higher, depending on kind of specific groups and populations you're looking at. So when I started to be able myself to give students a small window into my own experience, I found that so many of them would then come to me really eager to talk about how to practice law and how to kind of navigate their own professional identity given their own past experiences with trauma. So for me, it feels like it's the only responsible, student-centered, client-centered thing to do to find a way to address and incorporate trauma into my teaching. The other piece I'll say is the book that I co-edited, and I do want to emphasize co-edited with Malika Kaur, because Malika, who teaches at Berkeley and runs the Sick Family Center, a national nonprofit, she's the true visionary behind the book and really pulled me into the project. But there's a really great chapter in the book from Angela Harris and Monica Batra-Kashyap that talks about the trauma of law school itself, right? And I mean, trauma is a very broad term used in many different ways, but just the fact of historically and perhaps still presently, some aspects of law school itself can be quite challenging and even potentially triggering and traumatic for law students, especially as we see, the face of the legal profession changing and shifting over time, thankfully. But so those are some of my reasons why I feel like it's really important, and that kind of drove me to include thinking about trauma in my teaching and practice.
Thanks so much for describing that, because I really relate to what you're saying. And I'm also a survivor of trauma myself, having experienced family violence and also sexual assault. And I actually came to law school thinking that I would be able to advocate for children and try to elevate children's rights. So much of my motivation to go to law school was rooted in addressing trauma on a societal level and trying to make it better, improving the quality of life and people's rights. And I think that many law students probably have similar reasons for going to law school. The research that I did to write the chapter I wrote revealed that 80% of US law students have experienced adversity in at least one of 15 categories, including sexual assault, serious illness, natural disaster, or emotional or physical abuse. And then 70% of law students experience multiple such adversities. So, the high rates of adversity that law students come in with really do make trauma a potential reason why they're there, but also a reason why we should make trauma an important part of our teaching. And then secondly, the law is usually about people's, it's about how society is going to deal with people's worst experiences in life, and people contact lawyers at their worst moments. And so if we can actually address trauma explicitly in our teaching, we can ideally make help develop some of the best lawyers who can actually help shepherd clients through horrible experiences and help them come out with less harm than otherwise they would experience. So, and then I would also mention that there's a lot of trauma that law students experience during law school, whether it's homelessness, a death of a loved one, sexual assault. Life continues onward, and the students who have are minoritized through sexual identities or orientation, or with their racial background, or their struggles with financially, are at higher risk for experiencing trauma. And so I appreciate just like being able to talk about and sort of center trauma and self-care at the same time in this discussion.
Thank you both. As those of you who know me know, I can't let this go without making a few comments because we could spend the entire hour talking about what you just talked about. So I'll just add one little piece that I found important for folks who don't know this. The first research that I ran across was from Professor Jean Cole Peters, who's now retired from Yale, who wrote in 2001, when self-care wasn't even a vision, in legal education in large part, that self-care is an ethical responsibility. And I think for me, that really changed how I looked at it and how I approach it with my students. So can you just spend a little bit of time talking about what, and I'm going to use the term we're going to talk about in a minute, but for ease sake right now, what trauma-informed teaching looks like in your classroom. So do you have mental health professionals come in? Do you do a specific unit on trauma? And how does it inform how you're looking at cases, both in terms of a clinical case and then for Professor Tuchinda, how you approach it in your torts course? So can you just talk a little bit about what that actually looks like?
Sure. I'm not sure if I should go first and we can talk clinics and then we can talk non-clinical courses, which is very exciting. And that's one of the things the book tries to do, is to take this topic just out of the clinics and right into the broader law school curriculum and classroom. So on the question of kind of, do you bring in someone to discuss and kind of do the session on trauma, secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, right? All the different terms that you can use around these issues. I have experimented with that, and I do not bring in a mental health professional. I kind of have found that it works better to do it myself. And I will say, because of the book and because of other things I've written, I get asked to do this for other clinics pretty often, to come in and do their session on trauma, secondary trauma. And I don't think it works that well to bring in someone from the outside, whether or not like they could have all the expertise. And obviously I don't, and that's a huge caveat that I share with my students. And there are certainly times when we need to engage with outside mental health professionals. But I actually feel like it's a challenging topic and you need to have kind of done some groundwork and built some relationships with your students to get to it. And then you can really make sure that it's very tailored to the work that you're doing and the students that you have in front of you, right? And I don't recommend doing the class as like a part of like orientation in the first day or two. I actually think, unless you really have to, because you need students to be prepped in that way for something they're jumping into, then it's something that I would weave in a little bit later. And then I really do try and kind of weave it in throughout the semester. It's not like a one and done situation. It's not one class. There is one kind of core class, but then I try to make sure that we are using various exercises and reflection points on this throughout the semester. For me, a lot of it is to modeling self-care myself, right? Walking the walk, modeling responses to trauma and emotions, and actually sharing with the students when something has struck a nerve with me, when it's hit me in a certain way and I'm having an emotional response to it. So I recognize that I do that from a place of privilege, right? I think I'm a white woman operating in this space. I think there are certain ways I can be vulnerable. And there's a lot of power in vulnerability that may or may not work for others. I do use like different exercises throughout the semester. So I'll mention a couple. One is I really still like to use the well exercise it was developed at the Harvard Immigration Clinic with a social worker there, Liala Buonkati, I think. And it kind of, has students share in community what depletes them, what fills them up, assuming we have this kind of well or reservoir of energy. And then that does a few things, right? It gets them thinking for themselves. I always participate in myself in terms of, modeling for them. But then it also opens up this as like a community topic and something that's legit to talk about, something we can revisit together. And it helps to move the responsibility from like, you have to just take care of yourself to, hey, let's look out for each other and create ways for us to all have space and take care of ourselves. I also really like using a video, and I'll put it in the chat. It's like a 5-minute video from Headspace to talk about how to work in kind of micro, meso, and macro breaks. And it's really talking about burnout as a framing. And I really like it's, if you watch the video, you can see as a clinician how you would use it, right? It's very obvious, but it kind of is like a, 20, 25-minute exercise that's nice to kind of bring in, especially at a moment when the students might be feeling some of that overwhelm, or they might have had higher trauma exposure than at other points in the semester. And then I like to use a rounds class pretty often, explicitly focused on emotional responses to our case or project work or a trauma-related issue. And I'll say, hey, we are doing a class and like the topic we're going to select is to do with this. And then I do like the temperature checks in the classroom pretty routinely, and I'll do it around emotional responses, feelings, reactions, like, whoo, this was heavy, this was a lot, like how, one word, right? How are you feeling in response to that? And we'll kind of unpack it a bit. And then I do, like most of us, my supervision meetings are in teams, but I have started offering just one-on-one check-ins periodically, kind of like sometime, in the middle, not the mid-semester evaluation, because that's a time when you're usually sitting down with them one-on-one. So kind of before that and after that, just to have another window and opportunity to check in how they're doing. And a lot of that might be, career, summer jobs, right? How are your goals changing? How can I support you? But also mental health wise and how they might be navigating trauma. So for me, it is, I don't think I do a perfect job with this. And even this semester, I'm like, have I revisited this enough times? But I think that's my intention, right? And when it all goes to plan and well, it's really something that's integrated from the beginning to the end of the semester.
Thank you. Professor Tuchinda?
That's awesome, Lindsay. So just FYI, I actually started off as a clinician. I was a clinical teacher for 5 years in juvenile and special education law clinics, and also a medical legal partnership clinic. And I love clinical teaching, and I want to go back to it. I think that I try to use things I learned from clinical teaching and the emotional sensitivity that I think it requires, and I try to bring that into my doctrinal teaching. So I try to create a safe place in the classroom from the get-go, from the first class, and so I try to set it up through the syllabus by saying that I will not permit derogatory or bigoted statements, that and that I expect a professional and highly respectful level of discourse in the classroom, while also telling students that that I don't grade against students if they happen to disagree with me, as long as they have like strong, good justifications for how they think and write. So I tried, and then also the first day of class, I asked students to generate ideas with one another. So they have to talk to one another and think of this, but also as a class, I write ideas students have for creating. I asked them, how can you work together to create a safe classroom environment where everyone can feel that they can belong and have a voice? And so with that prompt, I asked them to brainstorm ways in which they could create that. And I think I take a picture and I remind students what they said, and sort of hold them accountable to following those ideas. And I think it helps to establish a tone of respect. But also, and whenever I teach about cases, I know that tort opinions, their language, tone, and the decisions themselves can undermine the dignity, safety, and decision-making of trauma survivors. And the law itself can be oppressive, and it can add to the feeling that law school is disillusioning and disappointing for law students who come in idealistic and want to do good and then realize the law is really flawed. And so I try to address the disappointment and disturbance that students often feel when they read cases. I teach torts, for instance, and whenever I know that students will be upset by the language, tone, or the actual decision of an opinion, I try to give them tools for analysis that helps them break down or like deconstruct the law. So whether it's having a reading from feminist judgments or quotations from critical legal thinkers or just bringing in some history about immigrants or you know, we will do the analysis ourselves, and I'll like point out, for instance, that a case doesn't mention anyone's race except for the Black male who allegedly committed a sexual assault, and like analyze what does it mean for the court to like highlight that, but not highlight anyone else's race. So I think trying to engage critical thinking about it, and like oftentimes I'm just trying to help them maintain hope that they can actually make the law better. So I'll also try to spend some time asking students, what can you do when the law is not what you think it should be, like when it doesn't provide justice? And then I also try to explicitly talk about what is justice? Did the court give justice here? How did the court's language and tone relate to justice? And then how could it have been different? How could it have been written differently? And where should the law go? And then also explicitly talking to students about how they will have power in the future to influence the law, whether it's in various roles, whether it's as judge, advocate, scholar, etc., and just like help them realize that they will be able to make the law better. So I do talk explicitly about that, and I try to comfort them. I also try to really enforce the safety of the classroom. So if students swear, or like I describe a story in my chapter about how a student really got upset while describing the facts of a court case regarding sexual assault. And so I try to support students' emotional well-being by having a rule of never being harsh. And by the way, I credit Yael Cannon at Georgetown University Law Center for that, because she was modeling it so well. But I just think I think professors in general just have an enormous amount of power to do good, but also to harm students, whether it's telling a student in front of the class that they would be fired, or I don't know, just like I've seen some unfortunate things happen in the classroom, and students take what we say to heart, and they can easily be harmed by us. So I think that generally I try to have a rule for myself, which is to avoid being harsh, because we often have the power to traumatize students beyond what we could ever imagine. And so I take that really seriously. But, you know, at the same time, I do have to give them clear and respectful feedback, and but I'm always trying to center their well-being and their hopes, and the fact that they might actually be going through a hard time unrelated to law school too, in my mind when I communicate with them.
Thank you. So many things. I do want to highlight one thing that Professor Harris said, and that is that one of the goals of the book, which is just amazing, and you know, I'm going through it for a second time now, just really focusing in, is that this isn't just about clinics, right? And Professor Tuchinda is just giving us an amazing example of how trauma work belongs in all the law school classes, which eventually may actually lead to some cultural shifts in our field. The other thing that Professor Tuchinda alluded to, that Professor Harris, I kind of want to direct this one at you, is about language. And we all know, we have lots of conversations with our students about language, how crucial it is for lawyers, and how it helps us focus, and also engage in very compassionate and powerful storytelling, right? We talk a lot about storytelling in our courses. But it also helps us adjust our lenses and how we frame issues beyond our own identities. So, Professor Harris, in the book, there's a section of discussion about trauma-informed versus trauma-centered. And I shared with you all last night that the first time someone told me I was teaching from a trauma-informed perspective, I went, what? I don't know what that means. And I really, the term has never really been satisfactory to me for reasons I haven't yet thought through. But there's a portion when your wonderful co-author talks about that and talks about trauma-centered versus trauma-informed and then trauma-light. Can you talk a little bit about those two terms that you use before we move on?
Yeah, and again, all credit goes to Malika on this, and I have fully adopted trauma-centered instead of trauma-informed at this point, and it's all because of her thinking and the conversations we've had around that. So I'll try and do a good job of explaining, although she would do better. So trauma-centered is really, moving considerations of trauma from kind of a peripheral concern, a kind of checkbox approach, to actually meaningfully integrating thinking about trauma and emotions into everything that we do. I think, we talk a lot about client-centered lawyering, right? That's came from the clinics and that kind of like historical lens. Now we talk a lot about like critical lawyering. And for me to be client-centered and to take into account systemic oppression and systems of bias, you need to also be trauma-centered, right? Trauma needs to be in there. And I also, this is kind of me speaking and not necessarily Malika, but also thinking about trauma-centered means that we're thinking about what the client has endured and the trauma that you might be exposed to in working with the clients. And I do like thinking about trauma exposure as a concept, but also your own, right? And what you are bringing to the practice of law and what you come with. And in my mind, you need to be conscious of that. You need to be centering that in case it kind of comes up, and it can be an amazing asset, right? It can mean that you are so much more attuned with what clients have gone through, that you have incredible empathy, that you are very driven. So there's so many wonderful things, like, I mean, not silver linings, but kind of, that come from having that lived experience. But there's also things that can make it really hard, and you need to be kind of checking in with yourself and making sure that you're okay, and that whatever is coming up is not clouding your judgment or making you over-identify with your client, right? And impose your feelings or judgment on theirs. So those are some reasons why trauma-centered rather than trauma-informed. For me, it's like, I said this when we were prepping for this session, but it's like the move in terminology from cultural competence to cultural humility. Trauma-centered is like, it's not just like, oh, we're informed by trauma. Okay, let's add this in. Let's say this one thing. Let's have a box of tissues and ask them if they want the door open, right? It's more than that, right? It's deeper. It's more integrated throughout the representation and the lawyer-client relationship. On trauma light, I think that's really a term that we came up with in writing the introductory practice to talk about kind of what trauma-informed sometimes can look like, which is that kind of more checkbox approach where it's like, oh, okay, we said trauma and we did a couple of things here, but it's not really digging in the same way that I think trauma-centered kind of requires and suggests.
I really appreciate that. And one of the things that you've talked about is a really important concept in the mental health field, and that is do your own work, sort of like physician heal thyself, right? And when you don't do your own work, it contributes to the high numbers we see in terms of mental health issues within the profession. So it was another thing from the book that I so appreciate, that this is about us and not just our students. So kind of a related topic, another thing I just loved about the book that we all talked about in prepping for today is that the temptation of a divide between clients' trauma as direct and ours and our students as indirect, often referred to as vicarious or secondary trauma, and certainly something we want our students to be aware of, but it leads to all kinds of issues. And one of the first ones is that traditionally we saw self-care directed at students who had never heard about things their clients were experiencing. And so the study of self-care was really limited to secondary vicarious trauma, teaching our students how to manage their responses to bearing witness. And there was, I don't want to say a footnote approach that maybe simplifies it, but there was this kind of add-on that recognized that some of our students will come to us with trauma history, but it was really followed up by, so they're at higher risk for secondary trauma. The book takes a much more holistic approach, right? And I think hopefully participants can see we've been weaving back and forth talking about trauma and self-care and not bifurcating those two concepts. So can you both talk about this holistic approach and how it recognizes a more inclusive view of our students, first of all, who certainly may have shared experience with clients and with the communities we're working in, and the same with ourselves. But it doesn't bifurcate these concepts. It looks at, trauma centered as including trauma of all the parties that we see in a case, and that actually may include adjudicators, right? And talking about what's happening for your judge. So can you just talk about that holistic approach?
You go first, Lindsay.
Sure. I think I don't have a great answer to this one, but I will say one thing I think that has helped to break down some of these binaries and that some people just aren't aware of is that the latest definition, and it's not even that, it's like a decade old, of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder from the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Statistician's Manual that the mental health profession uses, actually defines PTSD to include exposure to traumatic events and stories through the course of your work. So exactly what we are doing, right? In family law, in immigration law, in criminal defense work, in so many different areas of legal practice. And so I think that is helpful for me in thinking about this is we're talking about the same thing. And also, Mimi, as you flagged, that we don't come to the law as these kind of blank, clean slates, right? And sometimes the way I talk about this with students is a little bit like, it is kind of like the eggshell plaintiffs a little bit, right? In torts, because they've all taken torts and they understand that concept. But we're coming with some things, right? And that can make you, again, it can be a real asset and a strength, but it can also make you a little bit more vulnerable to some of the trauma exposure that you're going to encounter. And we need to be mindful of that. And also just kind of surfacing for students, look, we talk about this thing, we talk about secondary trauma or just straight up trauma from our work with clients. And that is actually like protective. And that's part of, responding to symptoms of secondary trauma if it comes up, but also preventing them from ever surfacing in the first place sometimes, because that knowledge actually kind of insulates you and you know what you're looking out for. You can be more mindful and kind of checking in on yourself. So yeah, I don't have a great answer to your really awesome question because it is so like blurred. The lines are so blurred for me and integrated that maybe I'm no longer the best person to explain this. I don't know if you have thoughts, Nicole.
Oh, I think whenever I think about like what I would want why engage with trauma at all, it's because I would want my students to be able to have sustainable legal practices over time, and they will definitely be dealing with, again, the hardest things that clients are going through, like, and I remember being at a corporate law firm, and actually, there is, at least at that law firm, there was a little bit of a bias amongst some of the associates who were like, don't do pro bono work because that's going to open a Pandora's box of, well, sometimes people would denigrate it by saying, well, sometimes your clients are crazy, or they would say, but what they are talking about is, you might be exposed to some of the pain that law deals with head on. And sometimes like people will try to sort of like get away from that by doing some like aspects of law that might be a little less exposed to clients' experiences of pain. But meanwhile, I think that when I think about what students are going to deal with in the long run, they ought to be able to process in a healthy way the traumas that clients endure, because trauma is so broadly defined, but also it's very, very common in our society and in the lives of our clients. And so whether, and now as a doctrinal professor, I think it's super clear that trauma is screaming out at us through the cases that we read about, because people don't litigate generally or want to deal with the law unless they have to, and the reasons why they feel like they have to is because they've been hurt so bad by something that's happened to them that they need a lawyer to help them get the compensation or a remedy that they otherwise wouldn't be able to achieve on their own. And so really it's about like engaging with students about how we are in a service profession, and if there's a way to actually process and lean into the pain that clients are experiencing and how that makes us feel, then that might the goal of that is to make the practice more sustainable. And so like helping students have tools for dealing with of clients' lives and how that affects us will help students have more sustainable practices.
Thank you both. That's actually really great answers. And Lindsay, I'll just say the fact that the lines blur is exactly how I've seen this move so far in the last dozen years. So Nicole, you raised an issue that I really want to focus on a bit, and that is, and this I noticed about, I don't know, 8-10 years ago, and what I've started to call the feel no pain movement. And that is, we shouldn't have students working on cases that involve emotional pain because it is too hard. And if that were really our philosophy, then we might as well close down clinical programs and public interest lawyering, right? And so I don't subscribe to that, but I think myself, and so many other clinicians in particular are hearing things like, well, let me just back up for a minute. When I first started teaching, it wasn't unusual for a student to come in and self-disclose. I'm a survivor of intimate partner violence, but I really want to work on this case involving such violence because I have a lot to contribute. And then it morphed about 8-10 years ago into students coming to discuss their own trauma history, but then saying, I can't work on a case that involves a similar trauma because it's triggering. And that represented a real shift to me that I was seeing and hearing from other clinicians as well. And along with that is, hearing from students, oh, I can't take this case because I promised my wife I would spend the weekend with her, or I'm taking a vacation mid-semester because I deserve it. And one of the things we talked about in prepping is that, I especially recognize as a boomer that this generation is so much better than we were at boundary setting and self-care. But the fact remains that the work still has to be done, and it's hard work. And it's always just when you desperately need a yoga class, is right when you have a brief due or a hearing to prep for. So, are our students setting good boundaries? And one of the things about the Feel No Pain movement that I've been doing in my writing lately research is that it tends to send a message that really you're too fragile to handle the work. And I don't believe we have fragile students. And so, the other questions around this are they setting themselves up for unrealistic expectations as to what it means to be a lawyer, right? So you don't get to make a list of clients you would serve and not serve. That's not how the world is going to work. And so can you talk a little bit about, and Nicole, you touched on it, in particular with the torts case and about the student not really comfortable reciting the facts. And I found that to be such a good balance. So if both of you could talk about that, about this argument that we shouldn't be doing these cases, it's too painful and it's too triggering, and what that means and how you work with that.
Oh yeah, thanks. This is such a great question. I think it's really important for students to care about self-care and think about what case mix would bring them, would allow them to have a sustainable, meaningful practice, while also impressing upon them that they have ethical duties so that when they have a client who needs to meet a deadline or is in an emergency, they often need to buckle down, do the work, and even if it means they lose some sleep, and even if it means those are some hard times for them, for the practitioner, but nonetheless also encourage students to, over time, advocate for themselves and shift their docket, like the types of cases they're getting, so that they can actually find the right mix of cases that is sustainable and is going to meet their emotional needs and isn't going to be something they take home every night and is really hard on them. Well, and then also, again, like back to the tools, like helping students have the tools and be open to supports such as therapy and social supports, including like community or colleagues who can talk about cases, people they can vent with about issues, connecting through conferences, or getting involve themselves in teaching, or whatever it is that helps them to have like some buffer regarding the rawness of the legal issues that they're facing. So I do think that there is it's very important to still build students' grit and their endurance and their resilience for being a support to others, to their clients during the tough times during their cases and meeting of deadlines, while also supporting in their long run their ability to take the cases that are good for their health and draw some boundaries. But yeah, it scares me to think that students could drop the ball ethically for clients who really need their help, and say, oh no, I gotta do something else is a priority. No, the client is the priority. And so I think that that's what we need to teach. And Mimi was mentioning a moment in my torts class when a student started sort of like describing the facts of a sexual assault tort case opinion in a very, very glib, happy way that struck their peers as very inappropriate. And so one of the students said that that was inappropriate, and it shut the student who was speaking down, and it was hard for them to actually continue talking about the case, even though they did provide some details about the facts. But I tried to balance, in my response, I tried to balance supporting them and giving them the benefit of the doubt with also saying, like trying to push them to actually tell us what the case said. So yeah, there's got to be a balance.
I'll just
Lindsay?
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit to that. I think, the tension that you surfaced, Mimi, is so great. It's really amazing we can have these conversations now. We went from kind of trauma and self-care being kind of ignored, and now sometimes it feels like our students can't do the work because they're taking care of themselves. And so, it's enormously frustrating, but I think there's a ton we can learn about the students, about self-care and about work-life integration. As well. And there's a generational divide, right? The older you get in clinical teaching. But what I try and tell myself when these issues come up is they are supposed to, especially in clinic, make mistakes and struggle with those boundaries. So while I find it incredibly frustrating when this happens, a student who is promising like, yeah, I can do that by Friday morning, I'm going to deliver that to the client, but then is taking the MPRE that day and kind of feels tired, and they blow through the clinic deadline because they need to engage in self-care, and they feel totally fine telling me that after the fact without communicating what they're doing at the time. Or traveling with students, as I do sometimes, and students missing a debriefing meeting because they feel too tired and had to take a nap. And it's like, those are really frustrating moments, but they also are learning moments, right? About communication, about managing your time, about anticipating your own needs, and also sometimes needing to power through, right? For the clients, and helping students understand that line, right? Like, when is it something where you can say, you know what, this doesn't need to happen by the morning. I'm going to sleep, or I'm going to go to my great grandma's 100th birthday, right? Because this is important and I don't need to do this thing. I also think, like, for me, I do share with the students that at least these days, I generally avoid some things. Like, I generally avoid working with children because it just hits me in a different way that would not make this work sustainable for me. And I also tell them, like, there's so much wrong with the world, right? There's so many ways you can engage. And so you can probably find a way to pick something, some area of the law or social justice that is sustainable for you. I think another thing that really comes up that we haven't touched on, it's a whole other topic that I'm integrating more and more these days, is neurodiversity, right? And that being a really important part of thinking about if you're tailoring it if you're tailoring your career and practice to yourself, right? How are you taking that into account? How does that affect how you show up and how you need to engage and kind of protect yourself and navigate legal practice too?
I think that's a great topic. You've adopted another kind of central premise too of therapeutic work, that is everything's grist for the mill. So, kind of looking at it that way rather than a problem, but it's a learning opportunity. Okay, so last, and I think the hardest question. this was going to be the title of an article in Trump 1.0, but doing immigration work during that, I never had time to blink, let alone write an article. But in today's political environment, what does self-care mean? What are you hearing from students? And because we've heard, some of our students are just devastated and thinking about shifting a specialty, which is really frustrating to watch them struggle with that. So have you changed the message in your classrooms around what is happening now, and how does that influence how you teach that? And then we'll open it up for questions from participants.
Well,
Save the worst for last, I admit.
I think it's helpful to surface. So I think one of the main themes too that might be coming out of this conversation too is like trying to surface issues with students and helping to have like a supportive conversation that helps them process things that and so I think that trying to address what's happening on the federal level and how it's affecting the law, I think ideally would be done actually through conversations that are organized by the school as well to like address, are we in a constitutional crisis? This is stressful. Like, what does it mean on a legal basis, but also how does this affect vulnerable populations and communities? And then I think that also it's really important to like address how a lot of people feel very helpless to this too, and like thinking about what role do we have in addressing what's going on, and what role will students have to address justice, and what people at the top are saying about equity, race, and a whole bunch of other topics that are super triggering for people like me, and people who care a lot about like racial justice and social justice, and so like helping students process and think of ways that they can take action both now and in the future, I think could be healing, but also like to remember to like get out of isolation, be in community, talk with people about it, take action in ways that they find meaningful. And what does that mean? So just like, and I think as a doctrinal teacher, I have less time to actually talk with students about that. And because I think to a certain extent, it's not appropriate for me to like, well, I also feel that it's important for me to stay fairly neutral in the classroom, but plenty of students to come to me in office hours and they want mentorship about how to deal with what they find to be super stressful on the national level.
Lindsay?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have great answers on this. I do think it's really important to note that we're not operating in a vacuum, and we just have to spend that time. And it feels like precious time, right? Especially in the non-clinical classroom, but also in the clinic classroom, because you feel these pressures to deliver on the curriculum and prepare students for the bar and practice. But we have to stop and take that time. And if you don't, I feel like it ends up exploding later on. In the clinical setting, at least at my school, I really don't think we can avoid it in the work we do in clinic. My students are, diverse backgrounds, faiths, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, from sub-Saharan Africa, from, family roots or themselves from Middle East, South Asia. So when things are coming up, there's someone who's directly affected or feels ties to what's happening. But we also just know each other in a more intimate way. So we do talk about it, we do unpack it, and sometimes we adjust, right? The work that we're doing, the timelines we're working on, depending on what's happening. What I do want to say is that I hear students talking about their doctrinal classrooms, right? Sometimes, and like, does this professor just not get what's going on? Are they not reading the same news that I'm reading? And I feel like not addressing that can just feel it can really lead to those, just higher feelings of feeling like isolated and like everything is spiraling downwards into ever darkness, which, it is. But not acknowledging that, right? And not surfacing it when we're in spaces together, I think can be very detrimental. And so I think even with the pressure to kind of, get through your content and deliver and, prep students for the midterm or get to your hypos and multiple choice questions at the end of class or whatever it is, not taking that time, I think, is a mistake, right? And finding ways that you can authentically discuss it and talk about it. It's really tricky and it requires bravery, and it also means you're not going to get it right all the time.
Right. And I just, again, have to put my mental health hat on for 1 second. Nicole alluded to the high numbers of students who are suffering. And there's been studies of law students since 1988, all of which show it's not just lawyers with high rates of mental health issues like addiction and substance abuse, but it's law students. And when we don't address things, they just come out sideways, including all of the things that I just mentioned. And so it's so dangerous to pretend that it's not happening. And it's so important to find a way to address it in our classrooms. Okay, so we'd invite folks now to turn on their cameras. We have a few minutes left for participant questions. Jocelyn, I don't have host ability. I don't know if that matters in terms of answering questions, but okay. All right, so if someone wants to jump in with the first question, we have a few minutes left.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump in. Just because I had a professor who really wanted to join today and couldn't because they're having their own symposium at Regent University. So Professor Kelsey asked if you all had any recommendations or insights into how we can build spiritual practices into this into the self-care movement.
Yeah, and I'll just comment first that the resilience literature, that's one of the most important resilience factors is some kind of spiritual practice, not necessarily joining an organized religion, but believing that you're a small part of something bigger. So I'll just kind of put that out there as the significance of the question and then let our panelists.
That's a fantastic question. I teach at a Jesuit institution, Loyola University in New Orleans, and there is, our faculty talk about trying to be creative about inserting spirituality into classroom discussion. And sometimes I'll do that through putting quotations into slides and like sometimes trying to see if we can ground conversation in like from a religious perspective. But I think that I could probably do more and am open to thinking of ways. I think that also going to Jesuit like values regarding social justice is also really helpful and is reflective of what Loyola is about. What do you think? I would love to hear other ideas though.
So I agree, Nicole, that this is really important. And I think we could have a whole discussion about what is spiritual and how we define spirituality. I think weaving in different perspectives from different faiths can be important, but also thinking about other ways that people can kind of connect with themselves, like getting out into nature, right? That can be a spiritual experience. It definitely is for me. I mean, in the last couple of years, I've been throwing myself into the bay doing cold plunging every Sunday morning. And that's working for me, but it's like outside, the sun is rising, I'm in community with a group of people. It's kind of amazing. That's not for everyone, but I'd recommend trying it. But also, weaving in some of the kind of mindfulness, right? Mindfulness and spirituality are connected. I think when we talk about mindfulness, it's non-secular, but almost every single faith, right, has some component of meditation or mindfulness in it. If you look at it, like some part of it. So I think my thinking on this is trying to expose students to different things and get them to recognize that, what works for one person isn't going to work for another. And it really is about knowing yourself and being open to trying new things. But I think spirituality is definitely a piece of it. I'm also at a Jesuit institution, and so there are kind of more natural openings for that. But we're also at a Jesuit institution where the students are absolutely not majority Catholic by any stretch of the imagination.
All right, thank you for that, Jocelyn. Probably have time for one more question. Okay, so other things that you would want to share about integrating self-care into your curriculum that we didn't cover, including even resistance to that, right? Like it's been a long 24 years since Professor Coe-Peters first talked about self-care. And I think we've come an amazing distance, but yeah, so any other last minute things?
I mean, one thing we haven't just shared, and I think this is really common, so I'm almost hesitating to share it, but is in the clinical space thinking about, billing clinic hours if they're having to track clinic hours. for self-care and kind of mainstreaming that concept. I know that's something that a number of people, I'm looking at Marcy on the call, and I know she does that in her clinic, I do it in mine. I think that's, you know, and yeah, I think just kind of surfacing it and being more open with students than you might. Like, I feel like I used to kind of hide from students when I was doing self-care stuff because I wanted them to think I was like working all the time. And I'm like, that's the wrong impression to give, right? Especially because I often am working in the evening. So I want them to know, like, hey, I actually like did this morning, and I didn't jump into my email and my work right away, right? Like I do have some sense of space and boundaries and not balance, but I like the work-life integration term rather than work-life balance, because professional, personal, they're going to collide, the boundaries are blurred, and you have to figure out how to do it all at the same time.
Exactly. Nicole, did you want to add?
I think it's self-care is like a process of connection with others while also at the same time doing like honestly like the trauma work, because I feel like just like exploring, trying to be sensitive to one's own emotions and like trying to process it, and to be honest, like spirituality for me is often about social justice, like work and being in community around what justice means, and trying to think about how we could do better as people and society. And honestly, like so much of what um, my work is about like self-care that is hopefully radiating to others as community care too. So it's about like the more that I can be healthy, especially about trauma, and like the more that I think I could know about trauma and how and know about how the world needs to get better. And sorry, I'm not necessarily articulating that all that well, but like the idea that you know, that we can learn from pain, and especially in trying to prevent it and make how the law looks better, because we know how hard sexual assault is, or how horrible other traumatic things have been, is and see it as sort of a resource rather than something that we're all just trying to fight against and avoid. Honestly, makes it a lot less hard for me. Like if I can just see it as something that can be a well of helpfulness, a resource, rather than just something to self-care against. Makes it
Yeah.
so much easier to integrate that into my life. And if I see that, you know, even client challenges and trauma in the same light, if I can see it in that way, it becomes so much easier to sort of work through the what it brings than to sort of reject it and try to like compartmentalize it and isolate it.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, and building spirituality around it really, really helps me.
There's so much we didn't get to talk about, but I just really want to thank our two panelists. This was a really important conversation, and just kind of from my personal wish list, I hope it's just the first conversation going forward about these topics, because it's going to be so important to do more than just survive the next however many years we're stuck with this. So thank you again, Professors Harris and Tuchinda. This was really wonderful. Thank you all for taking time in your Friday afternoon. And I don't know, Jocelyn, do you want to say?
Yeah.
Thank you all. It was a wonderful conversation. And I just want to let everyone know we will have our 4th episode on April 11th. At 12:30 at our standard time, and it's going to be our very own Professor Ngozi Nduli talking with Professor Miriam Gohara from Yale Law School about clinics addressing mass incarceration. So I hope we can take some of these self-care techniques and build it into that conversation. And thank you all again for joining us.
One last thing, please. If I could just add one last thing I said, because it was said at the beginning, I want to reiterate it, that we are so grateful that Lindsay came home, if you will, because she was the visionary for this series. So I just want to reemphasize that it was Lindsay Harris who really built out conversations with clinicians for us here at UDC Law. So we're very grateful, Lindsay, for you coming back.
Thank you. It's really nice to be
Absolutely.
back. I miss you guys. And yeah,
We
it's so
miss
great.
you
And I feel,
back. We miss you
and I
back.
also just feel like there's so many new faces that I want to engage with, and we didn't get to say hi, but I'm here. We can engage. The time zone and the country. So great to see you all. Thank you for having us. And thank you, Nicole. It's always, I'm like taking notes on what Nicole was saying, if you could hear me typing, because I always just get a lot from, I've spoken with Nicole a couple times, and I always just have a lot to kind of glean from that and take away for myself. So thank
Awesome.
you.
That's how I feel
Yeah, I cannot recommend this book enough, and that includes Nicole's chapter on, oh yeah, trauma and torts. That makes sense, duh. So really, really important, yeah, and something I had not considered. So
Thank you so
thank you
much.
both. Thank you, everybody.
Take care. Bye, everyone. Be well.
Bye.